and histories into a single national history, with a message that had been the practices of the Israelites that violated this book of Deuteronomy that led to their downfalls, and implies that Joshua, as well as David, was a foreshadowing of what Josiah could achieve. So in The Bible on Earth, it's argued that a lot of the tenets of the Jewish religion are created at the time of Josiah, projected back in time, and there's lots of retroactive statements about what the Jewish people should do. And some contemporary archaeologists suggest that Josiah was successful. He extended his territory northwards towards Bethel, a cult center in the kingdom of Israel, but then he met the Egyptian pharaoh, and Josiah is killed. The Book of Chronicles claims that despite the Egyptian pharaoh's lack of enmity for Josiah, Josiah insists on attacking him, and Finkelstein and Silberman suggest that the pharaoh may have objected to Josiah's expansionist policies, which could have threatened Egyptian dominance in the region. With Josiah's death, Egypt took control over Judah, and the new king of Judah, Egypt's vassal ruler, undid Josiah's changes, restored former shrines, and returned the country to religious pluralism. Then the Babylonian Empire comes in, takes control over Judah, sends many people into exile, and many of the people are deported. But again, according to some archaeologists, no more than 25% of the population of Jerusalem was actually deported to Babylon. And according to the book of Ezra and its parallel passages, when the deportees returned, their leader refused to allow the undeported Israelites to assist them in reconstructing the Jerusalem temple, apparently believing that only the former deportees had the right to determine their beliefs and practices that could be counted as orthodox. The undeported majority tried to stop the reconstruction. So the conflict between the returnees and those who had always been in Judah apparently required resolution, and Finkelstein and Silberman argue that the law in the book of Deuteronomy advanced by parts of the deported elite, the ancestors of the returnees, and the laws and legends of those who had always been in Jerusalem were melded together into a single Torah. So this could be the central authority able to unite the population of the restored Jerusalem. Artaxerxes, Darius's grandson, commissioned Ezra to take charge of Judah, and the Bible on Earth notes other academics who propose that Ezra himself was the final redactor of the Torah, noting that the Bible identifies him as a scribe of the law of the God of heaven, and he kind of brings it all together. All right, so that was an exploration of the conflicting origins of the Jewish people and the Old Testament, but all sides seem to agree that the identity of the Israelites is tied to a geographic area. Whether you think that they were an offshoot of the Canaanite people or that they were all descended from the patriarchs, there is a geographical definition of what it means to be Jewish. But what happens when the Jewish people leave Israel? What happens when the diaspora occurs and Jewish people are scattered all over the known world? What happens to the operative definition then? Let's look at what happens. And again, this is something that is heavily contested because it's happening in the ancient world and scholars have strong disagreement on. So I'll try to do my best to offer the differing accounts. So here is the traditional story of the Jewish diaspora. The Hebrew Bible talks about exile as those who were taken from the kingdom of Israel during the 8th century by the Assyrians, and those from the kingdom of Judah that were taken into exile during the 6th century by the Babylonians, and some returned. So in the first exile, many Israelites were deported to Mesopotamia, and the Jewish proper diaspora began with the Babylonian exile in the 6th century. So the Jews had two principal cultural centers after the overthrow of the kingdom of Judah in 586 by Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon. The first was Babylonia, the second was the land of Israel. But Jewish deportees returned to Israel after Babylon was in turn conquered by Cyrus the Great of Persia. The book of Ezra includes two texts said to be decrees allowing the Jews to return to their homeland after decades and orders the rebuilding of the temple. So for centuries, from the 6th century BC onward, there's a Jewish diaspora. Before the middle of the 1st century, in the AD or CE, in addition to Judea, Assyria, and Babylon, there were large Jewish communities in the Roman provinces of Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Crete, and in Rome itself. After the siege of Jerusalem in 63 BC, when afterwards it became a protectorate of Rome, emigration intensified across the Roman Empire because now Israel was connected to it. In 6 AD, the region was organized as the Roman province of Judea. The Judean population revolted against the Roman Empire in 66 in the First Jewish-Roman War, which culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. During the siege, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple and most of Jerusalem. So this eliminates the symbolic center of Judaism, and Jewish identity isn't geographically tied to the same way to Israel and Jerusalem as it was before, and talks about sacrifice and going to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices to Yahweh. In later texts of Judaism, like the Talmud, the discussion becomes much more metaphorical and abstracted, and Jews reformulate their self-definition and adjust their existence due to the concept that they might be permanently displaced, and the Messiah, when he comes, is no longer going to be a military leader that's going to fight for Israel and fight against the Romans in the way that in the New Testament it seems many people consider Jesus to be this Messiah as a political leader, but they conceive of the Messiah as something not so tied to the nation of Israel. In 132, Bar Kokhba led a rebellion against Emperor Hadrian. This was the Bar Kokhba revolt. It failed, and this resulted in the renaming of Jerusalem. After 4 years of devastating warfare, the uprising was suppressed, and Jews were forbidden access to Jerusalem, and this is a major deportation and a major part of the growth of the diaspora. So now you have Jews all over Europe, and due to increasing migration and resettlement, Jews divide into distinct regional groups. The Ashkenazi of Northern and Eastern Europe, and the Sephardic Jews of Spain, Portugal, North Africa, and the Middle East. And these groups have also had issues of persecutions and expulsions and deportations. They were expelled from England in 1290. They were expelled from Spain in 1492. These different groups, the Ashkenazi and Sephardi, have their own distinct practices, ethnocultural practices, distinct languages, like Ladino in Spain, which is a form of Spanish that has Hebrew and wrote in Hebrew characters, or Yiddish in Central Europe. But they also have a shared religion and ancestry. If you go on tours of European cities that have a large medieval quarter, like Prague and the Czech Republic, tour guides will tell you that there are parts of the cities where Jews were located, where Jews would be separate from Christian populations. This is a form of anti-Semitism, but it was also a practical way for medieval rulers to rule their city, where, for the most part, medieval rulers wanted peace and harmony. They weren't so much interested in persecution of religious minorities as they were in peace and effective tax collection. Many thought, well, if I separate people according to their religion, then this will limit as much violence and interreligious discord and fighting, and then I can have as much peace in my city as possible. You see similar dynamics playing out in Spain before the expulsion of Muslims and Jews in 1492. So what we have here is that Jewish identity isn't so much linked to a geographic center of Israel, but now the focus becomes much more on theology and practice and custom. So again, there's a shift in Jewish identity. So now I just gave the traditional account of the formation of the Jewish diaspora, but there are revisionist counts on this as well. A pretty popular one in recent years is a book that came out in 2008 called The Invention of the Jewish People. The book is by Shlomo Sand, a professor of history at Tel Aviv University. He began his work by looking for research studies about the forcible exile of Jews from the area bordered by modern Israel. What he found was there a significant lack of original sources, and these accounts come later. What he argues is that the discourse of the expulsion of Jews from the region, even though it's a very formative and important event in Jewish history, there isn't good documentation, and there's not enough sources to back up the traditional narrative. So what he argues in his book is that the expulsion didn't happen, that no one exiled the Jewish people from the region, and that the Jewish diaspora is a modern invention. Okay, so if that's the case, where do millions of Jews around the Mediterranean come from? After all, we have good documentation and good accounts that there is a people called the Israelites in ancient sources. There's different accounts from where they came from, but we know that there was a group of people there. We have evidence of them outside the Old Testament, and then we have evidence of millions of Jewish people in the Mediterranean world. So where do they come from? He says that they primarily came through religious conversion of local people. The traditional account of Judaism is that it's not a religion of converts the way that Islam or Christianity would be. But he says, to the contrary, that it was very much a religion of conversion in earlier times. The mass conversions were first brought about under the influence of Hellenism, and they continued until Christianity rose to dominance in the 4th century AD. So he thinks that Christianity could have gotten its cues of being a conversion religion from Judaism. So in terms of Jewish origins, Sand says that it's likely that the ancestry of most contemporary Jews stems mainly from outside of Israel, and that the nation race of Jews with a common origin of Israelites never really existed, and that in the same way that most Christians and Muslims aren't the descendants of the very first members of that religion, instead, their forefathers were also converts as well. And in the same way, he says Jews also descended from converts. Sand says that Judaism was, like these two other monotheistic religions, a proselytizing religion, and mass conversion to Judaism occurs all over the place. You can see it in the Caucasus region, among the Khazars, the Berber tribes in North Africa, the Himyarite kingdom of the Arabian Peninsula. So in early histories of Islam, amongst the people that Muhammad encounters, in addition to pagans and Christians, are also Jews. So Sand says that the original Jews did live in Israel, but they weren't exiled by the Romans, followed by the Bar Kokhba revolt. He said that Romans permitted most Jews to remain in the area of what they would have called Palestine. So the story of the exile was a myth promoted by early Christians to recruit Jews to the new faith. He says, they portray the event as divine punishment imposed on the Jews for having rejected the Christian gospel. Sand says that Christians wanted later generations of Jews to believe that their ancestors had been exiled as punishment from God, and the idea is that if your old religion is no longer currying the favor of God, you might as well convert to the new religion and the full revelation of God, which is Christianity. And then following the Arab conquest of Palestine in the 7th century, many local Jews converted to Islam and were assimilated among the Arab conquerors. Sand says that these converts are the ancestors of the contemporary Palestinians, and then he says that the birth of the myth of a Jewish people as a group with common ethnic origins has been summarized as follows. At a certain age in the 19th century, intellectuals of Jewish origin in Germany, influenced by the folk character of German nationalism, took upon themselves the task of inventing a people retrospectively out of a thirst to create a modern Jewish people. So Jewish historians began to draw the history of Judaism as a history of a nation that had been in a kingdom, became a wandering people, and ultimately turned around and went back to its birthplace. So he says that contemporary Jewish studies tries to link the nation of Israel to the historical Israel, and saying that the nation of Israel is sort of a rebirth of what originally happened, and that the Jewish diaspora managed to maintain the bloodline of this Israel that existed there in the ancient world and was fully restored there. Sand says that this narrative is similar to other nationalist myths in Europe, where there was a golden age of the Germans or the French people that go back to time immemorial, and the modern nation state is just a way to put an official stamp on this historical people that has existed since time immemorial. He says that Jewish people found theirs in what he calls the mythical kingdom of David, and he says that before this invention, Jews thought of themselves as Jews because they shared a common religion, not a common background. So he would say that Jewish identity doesn't stem from a common heritage or a common ethnicity, but common beliefs. Sand thinks that before the birth of Zionism in the late 19th and early 20th century, where there was a political movement and a national movement of Jewish people to return to the traditional historical land of Israel, that the idea of Jews being obliged to return from exile to the Promised Land was alien to Judaism, and that holy places in Israel were seen as places to long for, but not to be lived in, because the holy places of Israel had been abstracted after the destruction of Jerusalem. He said that for 2,000 years, Jews stayed away from Jerusalem because their religion forbade them from returning until the Messiah came. Sand says that the ancestry of Central and Eastern European Jews stems heavily from medieval Turkic Khazars who were converted to Judaism. So that's a definition that he argues. Judaism is a set of commonly held beliefs. It's not an ethnic group. It's not people who are historically from a particular geography. But as I said at the top of this episode, one of the challenges of Jewish identity is